Thank you very much. Especially to Wahid Sahab, Zain Sahab, Irfan, the Department of Sociology here for inviting me. Aligarh always brings back very pleasant memories. I was a student here. In fact, I have very pleasant memories of this room itself, listening to some very, very famous speakers, learning from them. So yes, when I was invited to come here, I actually jumped at the invitation. I said, this is an opportunity for me to come back. I'm back. I'm coming back after I think 12 years. So the last time I was in Aligarh was 12 years ago. A lot has changed, and of course, I will not be speaking about my experiences in Aligarh. I will be speaking about globalization. I think both me and Tanvir Bhai, we have a kind of a division of labor in which I'm going to do a kind of a general survey of globalization and try to understand the phenomenon of globalization. When we think about the idea of globalization, in Hindi we say bhumandalikरण. I'm always intrigued by similar terms in other languages. We often get this feeling that this is a phenomenon which is very recent. It's just happened in the last 3 decades, 4 decades. Aisa nahi hai. This phenomenon actually goes back 500 years. A lot of people look at the processes of globalization as being set in motion by global capitalism itself. And if you look at the history of capitalism, it goes back at least 500 years. What capital was able to do was it was able to integrate the globe into increasingly a single common market. This is what we notice. I mean, of course, the thrust towards creating a common market is, it's something which is being attained by more recent globalization. But the point that I want to emphasize at the very beginning is that the process of globalization is not of very recent origin, but it has a much older vintage to it. And I think it's important to be able to understand this long history behind globalization. So I think that's the first point that I would want to emphasize, and I'll be open to answering questions on many of the things that I talk about. Having made that point, let me move on to another aspect of globalization. I'm going back in time a bit, so I'm doing a kind of a broad brush stroke survey of globalization, looking at a broad sweep of 500 years of history, which is a long time to cover. If you go back 500 years, okay, suppose one was to kind of put oneself in a time machine and to go back 500 years. The Aligarh Muslim University would not be here, of course. But this would be the time of the great empires, the Mughal, the Safavid, the Ottoman, the Habsburg. These were great empires. The three contiguous empires, the Mughal, the Safavid and the Ottoman, have been referred to in a very famous work by Marshall Hodgson, in his very famous work, multi-volume work, Lecture on Islam, as the gunpowder empires. Okay, these were great empires, their territorial sweep was vast. Now, the reason why I'm talking about these empires is because these empires were able to capture large swathes of territory and were able to retain control over this territory for 400 years, for 500 years. I mean, the Ottoman Empire lasted for more than 500 years. The Mughal Empire would last for, for something like 300, 400 years. Now, this is a long time for a political entity to be able to continue to exercise control over such vast amounts of territory. Aap zara sochein. Think of the expanse of the Ottoman Empire. Centered in the city of Istanbul, okay, earlier called Constantinople, usse pehle usko Byzantine kaha jata tha. Stretching into large parts of Eastern Europe, controlling territory in North Africa, large parts of the Arabian Peninsula. So, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that these empires were able to set in motion such large political and economic forces, and the impact of those forces are things that we still feel in our own lives. The Mughal Empire, the whole of the Indian subcontinent, was at one point in time completely controlled by this unit. The empire that I want to emphasize is perhaps an empire that's not very familiar to some of us. This is the Habsburg Empire, okay, centered in Europe. Now, as the Habsburg Empire expanded into the Iberian Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal. Okay. Napoleon very famously said about the Iberian Peninsula that, Africa begins after that. It has this very strange, anomalous relationship to the rest of Europe. But the point I'm trying to make is that when the Habsburg Empire extended into the Iberian Peninsula, this facilitated the spread of this empire into the New World, Mexico, Latin America, and in a kind of a global girdling movement, it came all the way up to the Philippines. As you can see, these great empires created the momentum for the process that we understand as globalization. Okay, these were the territorial units. Now today we live in an era of nation states. I will have more to say about nation states, and hopefully, let me keep track of the time because hopefully I will end my discussion on the whole question of nation states and middle classes and working classes and underclasses, which is the title of my lecture. But I'm kind of in the first 10 minutes or so trying to kind of give a broad historical understanding of the process of globalization. Now, having made this point about the origins of globalization going back many hundreds of years, of course, the kind of technological advancements that we see today had not happened in those days. But transportation was one thing that certainly became very important. In those days, of course, air transport came much later. That's the 20th century. The Wright brothers created the first aircraft which flew for something like 12 seconds, and that was a major achievement. But in the immediately after, because of these empires, especially the Austro-Hungarian, when it was kind of the Habsburg, when it was expanding into the New World, seafaring, shipbuilding became a very important vehicle of this whole process of globalization. Of course, the Ottoman Empire was a largely landlocked empire. Similarly, Mughals never really seemed to express much interest in going beyond the expanse of the Indian subcontinent and expanding into the sea. But the point that I'm trying to make is that in the early days of globalization, one of the most important technological advantages in terms of transportation was large shipbuilding. This was what created the possibility of being able, especially some of these empires, to be able to girdle the globe, as I call it. So this point that I'm making about these three empires, the Ottoman, the Mughal, and the Habsburg, it's a point that is made by the very famous historian Sanjay Subramaniam. Some of you may have heard of the name of Sanjay Subramaniam, but he makes this particular point about these empires. Now it's important to keep in mind that these are early empires. They are superseded in their importance by the seafaring abilities of the Dutch and the British, who come a little later after this. It's with the British, the British Empire, that naval expansion becomes a very important thing. But to kind of go back to the central part of my opening remarks, it is to talk about this particular historical background of globalization. How globalization is a phenomenon that has been with us for many years. It's not something which has just happened. I mean, the year that I came to ANU was the year 1991. This is the year in which Manmohan Singh announced the new economic policy, liberalization, which completely transformed the very nature of India. Well, it didn't transform the nature of India, but it transformed the way that the economy operated. And I still remember Manmohan Singh announcing, when he was the finance minister, announcing the new economic policy. And he did it with an Urdu couplet. He said, "Sarfaroshi ki tamanna hamare bidil mein hai, lekin hazur kitna bazu hai qatil mein hai." I think Manmohan Singh should have said that with a little more of a flourish, because when you deliver an Urdu couplet, it should be done with a flourish. But of course, Manmohan Singh, being Manmohan Singh, has a certain kind of flat monotone with which he talked about things. But anyway, I still think he remains one of the most illustrious prime ministers of India and finance ministers, because he changed the way that India, the economy operates. But to come back to the point that I'm trying to make, I'm using my own experience coming here to ANU. This is the year that I think of as the year that signaled, it was the year that signaled the new economic policies of India. Now, we were naive in those days, young people, and when young people are naive, of course now we have become a little more cynical. Vaits are referred to us as naive, I think, as young. I think we've now become middle-aged now, graying hair, so anyway. But let me say that, 1991 held out a certain promise for people. Okay, the promise was that now the world would come to India. India was a very different country before that. Okay, we had remnants of what is called the socialist economy. India still, in the preamble, is a socialist country. It's very ironical that the term socialism should be there, because as far as I can understand it, the path that we have set upon for ourselves is a very capitalist path, inviting private investment and so on. But the recent expanse, or the recent, this recent stage of globalization is what is going to occupy the major part of my lecture. Wales have talked about 4 decades. I completely agree that 4 decades have been very, very important. So let me step back. Let me go back to the decade of the 1970s. This is the decade that I was born in. I have vague memories of the late 70s. 79 would be the year of my first memory. I was 4 years old. So you know, it's a very important year, 1979. I'll tell you the reason why it's an important year. Some years ago, there was a book that came out. It was called Strange Rebels, and the subtitle was 1979 and the Birth of the 21st Century. It's written by a journalist called Christian Carroll. Very interesting book. Not a very serious academic work, but I think once in a while, academics like us should be able to engage with some of this breezy writing that journalists engage in. Carroll made a very interesting point, and the point that he made was that if you want to understand the 21st century, and remember the 21st century is the century of high globalization, the technological advancements that we have witnessed in this century have been astounding and unimaginable. I carry with myself a smartphone. When I was a student at Aligarh, my parents, I would get in touch with my parents by going to a PCO, a public call office, okay? And when I made a phone call to my parents, if I did it in the afternoons, I would be charged much more money. So we would call them up late at night after 10 o'clock. Now look at the way that communications has changed. It's been absolutely breathtaking and dramatic. So as I said, the 21st century is a century of dramatic developments in technology, communications. We are living through the communications revolution. Okay? So, a lot of my lecture now will not be about the past. I kind of set a historical background by talking about the past. I will now talk about the 4 decades that have gone by, and I'm talking about the year 1979. I'm borrowing from Christian Carroll's argument. So Christian Carroll makes the point that if one wants to understand the 21st century, or 21st century is now 18 years old. Okay, 18 साल का आदमी होता है ना, वो जवान हो गया. Adult, you're an adult if you're 18 years old. If you do something wrong, you can be sent to jail. Not a juvenile court. And the 21st century has turned out to be a pretty brutal century. It's been really, really bad. I mean, I'm a pessimistic person. I don't like this, to be pessimistic, but I think it's important to warn young people of the very difficult and fraught times that we are living in. Now, what is Carroll's point? Carroll's point is that if you want to understand this developing 21st century in its fetal stage, जब इंसान बच्चा होता है माँ के पेट के अंदर, that fetal stage, go back to the year 1979. And one will be able to understand exactly the ways in which the 21st century is developing into the kind of century that it is now developing into. So what was so special about 1979? Let me go through some of the important things that happened in 1979 and which kind of set the momentum for globalization as we understand it. 1979 is the year of the Iranian Islamic Revolution, 14th of February 1979. 1979 is the year in which the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. 1978, a year before 1979, Deng Xiaoping and the economic policies that he introduced made China into the kind of economic powerhouse that it is today. It is considered to be an economic powerhouse. It's a superpower. Okay? Deng Xiaoping was responsible for that. 1979 is the year in which a certain British Prime Minister called Margaret Thatcher came to power. And her rule has been momentous. It has huge consequences, which I will try to talk about. The year after 1979, 1980, Ronald Reagan became the President of the United States of America. In 1979, a particular Polish Pope John Paul II became the Pope. And his years in office from 1979 to 2005 were extremely important in bringing the Cold War to an end. So as you can see, 1979 is a year in which many, many important things are happening. The idea of the market that we understand was introduced by leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. These are leaders that I don't particularly like. I have my own antipathy towards certain leaders, and most political leaders I don't like. But if I were to put some leaders at the top of the ones that I really dislike, it would be people of this kind, because the impact that these leaders have had is in terms of huge inequality that we experience in the world today. So the point that I want to make now is that one of the things that globalization has done is that it has created huge inequalities in society. In the year 2014, an economist called Thomas Piketty wrote a book, Capital in the 21st Century, in which he talked about widening inequalities in society. Equality is a very important concept. The idea of equality was most famously introduced back in the 18th century when the French Revolution broke out in 1789. Liberty, equality, fraternity, these were the 3 slogans of the French Revolution. We live in extremely unequal times. I live in the city of Delhi. I've lived in Delhi more than half my life. I've lived more than half my life on JNU campus. It's quite remarkable. But one thing that I've noticed is the way that inequalities have gone up in the city that I live in. It used to be a quiet city once upon a time, but one indicator of how unequal things are becoming in Delhi is the flashier cars that you find on the roads of Delhi, and the greater numbers of people who at the red lights accost you and ask you for the spare change that you might have in your car. I mean, it's just like it's a kind of a simple indicator of how one can see equality around us. Of course, there are statistical measurements like the Gini coefficient, GINI, Gini coefficient, by means of which the levels of inequality in any economy are measured. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that political leaders of the variety of political leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan systematically introduced policies that were to undermine something called the welfare state. And because of the undermining of the welfare state, the levels of inequality in our societies have gone up tremendously. Now, what is a welfare state? The welfare state is an institution which guarantees that no one falls below a certain basic minimum. There are certain socio-economic rights that are guaranteed to people. So, what I'm emphasizing now is that unfortunately, the way that globalization has unfolded is that it's been a game that has been loaded against the people who are the poor, the vulnerable, the ones who have least education. These are the people who have been the most vulnerable. Okay, there are terms to describe this. Guy Standing uses the term precariat to talk about how there are some people whose class positions are so precarious that perhaps, let's say, falling ill would mean that that person's whole savings are wiped away, or he or she would have to sell his or her house. Now, that's something that the welfare state protected people from. So if you fell ill, for example, the state would be there to take care of your healthcare charges. So one of the most effective healthcare systems in the world, the British National Health Service, set up in 1946, if I'm not wrong, just after the Second World War, was able to prevent people from becoming destitute because they just fell ill. Okay, so the point that I'm stressing here is that one of the major fallouts of globalization has been higher and higher levels of inequality. This has hugely impacted the class structure of societies. So one of the most vulnerable of these classes has been what Guy Standing calls the precariat. Now let me come to the middle class, because this is something that interests all of us, and I will have certain things to say about the middle class. Whenever we talk about the middle class in India, there are two important books which in some way kind of give us a point of reference for understanding the middle class. One is a book that came out in 1955 by someone called B.B. Mishra. It's called The Indian Middle Class. And the point that Mishra is making is that the middle class in India was a class that was created by government service. In India we have this very unique term, service. Service ka matlab hota hai people who served in government departments. Of course, now we live in a globalized economy, in a service economy, when the term service means something very different. But the term service in India had a very, very specific connotation to it. And Mishra's point was that the middle class in India was a class that was created by employment opportunities in the government sector. Okay, this was 1955. The other work, which is often used as a kind of a reference point in order to understand the middle class, is more recent, came out 11 years ago, 2007, by Leela Fernandez. It's called the New Indian Middle Class. And the point that Fernandez is making is that what characterizes this new Indian middle class is not the fact that it is employed by the government, but in terms of its consumption patterns. Okay, this has been a great change for people like me. Okay, we've lived through at least my generation has lived through this change. Globalization is that kind of that big dividing line. Okay, I mean, India before that for me was an austere socialist India, where material comforts we were not very familiar with material comforts. I mean, the India of my childhood was where if there was a mohalla of, let's say, 50 houses, one house would have a telephone, the whole mohalla would be serviced by that telephone, so someone's relative calling up, someone in-laws calling up would call that house. There'd be perhaps 5 television sets, and the whole mohalla would gather and watch television in one person's house. All of that's changed. What we see are enhanced consumption levels, where perhaps one family will own 3 cars. So my neighbors own 3 cars, for example. That shows the way in which India has been changing. And a lot of people who live on the road that I live on. I mean, these are just indicators to develop, to kind of bring up the ways in which the middle class has changed in India. Now, it's clear that the middle class of India and China has, in the last 35-40 years, experienced enhanced levels of material consumption. It's been good. I mean, many of us have been beneficiaries of this. The way that our lives have been transformed. It's unthinkable to own a mobile phone. We would think and wonder about these devices, when people told us about these things. So, as I said, things have changed for the middle class. But the interesting thing is that as the economic fortunes of one class have risen, the economic fortunes of another class have fallen. And that's the important thing about the discipline of economics. When I was a student of economics, as Wahid pointed out, then I switched loyalties to political science. But the point that I'm trying to make is that in these globalized times, it's important to be able to understand that the beneficiaries of globalization are people who may be benefiting at the expense of other people in a certain other part of the world. So let me explain what I mean. You must have heard of a country called Greece. It's gone through a financial crisis. The Greek finance minister, former Greek finance minister, was a very interesting man, a man called Yaris Varoufakis. Okay, my pronunciation of Greek names is very bad, but he made this interesting point. Before he became the finance minister of Greece, he was an economics professor at a number of high-profile universities in the West, and he made this point about the rise of the middle class in India and China. That the rise of the middle class in India and China has been simultaneous to the fall of the working class in the advanced Western democracies. You see the globalization and its interconnectedness that I'm trying to bring out? The rise of the middle class in these parts of the world is connected to the fall of the working class in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Europe. This is connected to the movement of manufacturing jobs from the advanced capitalist world to Southeast Asia. So you've heard of the Asian miracle, the East Asian tigers, countries like Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia. All of these economies were economies that boomed in the 80s and 90s. Now what this created for the working class, especially, let me take the example of the US and the UK because these are the two countries that I look at the most. What this created was a phenomenon called deindustrialization. So when I look at globalization and the onset of globalization and the technological changes that are happening as a result of globalization, one of the important things that globalization is also doing is a complete loss of manufacturing jobs and the complete breakup of the manufacturing base in countries like the US and the UK. So in the US, it created this loss of manufacturing, created what is called the Rust Belt states. Okay, states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. These states are important because these were the states that voted for Mr. Trump in the 2016 presidential elections. Okay, so again, I'm trying to point out interconnectedness here. So, the story of globalization that I'm trying to tell now is a story in which the working class has had it really, really bad. Of course, the working class in our country has it really bad anyway. But the working class in advanced capitalist countries whose living standards went up in the 3 decades after the Second World War. So from 1945 until the 1970s, there was a continuous trend of incomes improving, consumption levels improving, health indicators improving. This suffered a drastic decline with the onset of hyper-globalization, if I can call it. Okay, let me give you an example of this. There's a sociologist, I don't know which nationality he is, but he's a student of a very famous sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, Loic Wacquant. He's French. Loic Wacquant, thank you. Wacquant writes about the post-Fordist hyper-ghetto in America. Okay, now what is the post-Fordist hyper-ghetto? A ghetto is a place that is inhabited by people who don't want to live there. I mean, that's terrible. I like the place that I live in. JNU campus is it's a very pleasant place to live in. It's nice and green, it's nestled in the Aravallis, the southern ridge. In the mornings I get to see peacocks and nilgai and things like that. It's very, very pleasant. But if you were to live in an area that you don't want to live in, against your will, that would be what we refer to as a ghetto. Wacquant refers to a ghetto as a place of exclusionary enclosure. Okay, people are put there who need to be excluded and enclosed. Okay, so the blacks of America, who have been people who lost out in the game of globalization, live in the post-Fordist hyper-ghetto. Okay, there are very famous ones. Harlem, for example, in New York is very, very famous. It borders the Columbia University campus. Some very famous leaders have come out from Harlem. There was the Harlem Renaissance back in the 1920s when there were writers who were living there and who were writing important books. Malcolm X, the famous black Muslim leader, was also a product of the Harlem ghetto. But again, the point I'm making is that what has globalization done? Globalization has created these spaces in urban areas where people are made to live because they can't live anywhere else. These areas are areas of heightened police surveillance, drug peddling, gun running, all kinds of crime. From the accounts of the ghetto that I have read, this is no place where you can raise children in a normal environment. The levels of violence that people face in the American hyper-ghetto is comparable to the levels of violence that one faces in dysfunctional states in Africa, and that's how bad things are. As you can see, what globalization has done is that within the first world, it has created pockets of third world poverty. In the third world, it has created pockets of first world affluence. So every time